All right. Welcome everybody to The Importance of the Impossible, a conversation about the archives of the impossible. My name is Whit Forrester. I'm one of the co-founders of Ninth Planet Curatorial Collective. The other members are David A.M and Trisha Lagasso Goldberg. We are really excited to facilitate this conversation, and I will be introducing our moderator, David A.M. Goldberg, who is a Black San Franciscan, came of age in the era of the Commodore 64, 1200 bought online culture, and the birth of hip hop. His writing and research maps intersections of art, race, technology, and history with a focus on generative AI, collective intelligence, and digital epistemologies. Professionally, he is a lead product designer and strategist of interactive content that is grounded in the authentic experiences and desires of underrepresented folks. He holds degrees in computer systems engineering from Howard University, visual criticism from California College of the Arts, and a PhD in American Studies from the University of Hawaii at Manoa. Handing over to David.
Thank you, Whit, and good evening, everyone. Welcome to this talk we're about to have. We're hoping you enjoy the wide-ranging discussion that we're looking forward to. The first guest we're going to welcome is Jeffrey Kripal. He is the J. Newton Reisner Chair in Philosophy and Religious Thought at Rice University, where he co-hosts the Archives of the Impossible Collection and Conference Series. He's the author of numerous books, most recently, How to Think Impossibly About Souls, UFOs, Time, Belief, and Everything Else. And he is presently working on a three-volume collectively entitled The Superstory, Science Fiction, and Some Emergent Mythologies. His full body of work can be seen at the website after his name. And as an added bonus, he thinks he may be Spider-Man. Our second guest that's joining us this evening is Amanda Nedham. I'm hoping I'm saying your name right. Please correct me when you come on if I'm not. And she's an artist, educator, and curator currently working on her PhD in the Department of Religion at Rice University, where her work focuses on the intersections between drawing and belief. She is an interdisciplinary practitioner with an emphasis on drawing and installation and communion with the dead. Needham co-founded Below Grand Gallery, located in the Lower East Side in New York, has taught experimental drawing at RISD and at the New York City Crit Art Club. I'm sorry, the New York City Crit Club, and has published one book, My Boyfriend is a Peacekeeper. She did her BFA at OCAD University in printmaking and her MFA at RISD in painting. Last but not least, our third guest this evening joining us in conversation is Peter Skafish, co-founder and director of research for the Soul Foundation and visiting scholar at Harvard University Center for the Study of World Religion. He's the sociocultural anthropologist who works between his discipline and philosophy on how ideas, cosmologies, and translations shape the diversity of human thought and experience. He's the author of the book Rough Metaphysics, The Speculative Thought and Mediumship of Jane Roberts, holds a PhD in anthropology from the University of California, Berkeley, and has held faculty and research positions in the US, France, Canada, and Germany. So I'd like to give a warm welcome to all three of our panelists. Turn your cameras on. Make sure this is working here. Here the folks are appearing one by one. I'd also like to take this moment to give a huge shout and thank you to Slashart, who is helping make this possible this evening. If you have not seen the show, Lagrange Point, curated by Ninth Planet, please do so. They've got a closing event tomorrow. You'll hear a little bit more about that by the end of the evening. But for now, let us jump into our discussion. So I want to start this off with a quote from Jeff Kripal's book, The Flip. Thinkers after Newton would soon declare that the math and the mechanics did not need the concept of God to work, that all of that was unnecessary and unconvincing anyway, and that from here on out, it was only knowledge of quantities that would count as real knowledge. And I want to use this quote to sort of frame this discussion as we start thinking about art, drawing, the nonverbal humanities, and extending our perception and our cognition through artwork. In this space, can you give us a little bit of an idea of where that quote is coming from and what it's addressing, Jeff?
Well, that's a little book I wrote um, about 7 years ago called The Flip on epiphanies of mind and the future of knowledge. And essentially what it's trying to do is sort of make obvious what the relationship between mind and matter is in a particular person's thought. I think everybody assumes some kind of relationship or non-relationship, and the book is really just trying to draw that out and making this argument that we're sort of moving toward a certainly in the philosophy of mind and in anthropology and departments of philosophy, there is a move towards a kind of panpsychic or more idealist position. And I'm just trying to articulate that, and that we're coming from a very materialist oriented scientific worldview that people are starting to not see as wrong, but see as inadequate to the full human experience.
Great. Do either Peter or Amanda, did you want to riff on that at all before we jump into it? This idea that the numbers are not enough.
I, Amanda, do you mind if I might slow us down a bit by asking people if they're okay before I jump in, since it's hard to coordinate that on Zoom. And thanks, David, for hosting this, and Jeff and Amanda for joining, and Whit for the great show, and nice to see you again, Tricia, and thanks for curating. Um, I want to add, because I think it'd be a useful point to keep in mind, that the contrary, um, and the thing opposed to quantification and quantitative data is often the qualitative, and that seems like a common sense thing to say. But I want to put it on the table because in the fight in the 20th century from pluralist philosophers, and let's say process philosophers, and radical empiricists, against the quantification of being or the equation of being with quantity, quality was often given just as great of a status. And you can see that in James in different ways. You can certainly see that in Alfred North Whitehead, and you can see that, of course, also in Deleuze. And I mention all of that, and also I would add in anthropology through Claude Lévi-Strauss, and so I'd add all that because I think here we have the challenge to think about what the status of sense perception, quality in that sense, and other things that scientists would cast as quality, what their status is as mediators between ontological modalities that we're trying to put together or to think the relation of, namely matter and mind, if we believe in such things. And yet, the show shows us that the aesthetic is somehow central to dealing with that problem and thinking through whatever conundrum it forms for us. And I'd add that then challenges us to think about how things that we might cast as anomalous or extra physical or non-physical still need a very peculiar physical support and sense data for us to even begin to think about them.
Right. Great segue, I think, because this brings us both to Amanda's work, and I'd love for you to riff on that point and then use that as a way to talk about how you came upon the archives of the impossible, like what they are, and like where your work intersects. Because we automatically jumped into ontologies and various philosophers and stuff like that. And though I'm sure there are folks in our audience that are right up to speed, I want to be a little. I also want to be generous, and do a little. We'll spin the wheel around and get at your work to help ground and illuminate some of these ideas about the matter and mind conflict, or differences about quantification versus qualification, and then how your work dealing with drawings of these impossible things, right? Beings, experiences, entities, vehicles, how that works for you in this moment that we're looking at.
Sorry. Yes, where do you want me to start with how I
Yeah, let's
found
start with, yeah, what are the archives of the impossible? How did you find them? Why are they
Yeah,
so cool? And now,
yeah.
what's the ontological status?
Those are all great questions. Uh, yeah, so I was curating in New York. I ran a gallery and I started, well, but just quickly prior to that, I was at doing my master's and trying to focus on drawing. And I found that all of the conversations around it were far from generous in ways that were surprising and disappointing. And that sort of carried on into the art world proper. So I was traveling and looking at, cave paintings and petroglyphs and drawings made in Inquisition era prisons in the 18th century, and thought, these are, deeper, richer conversations. And I'd sort of been, holding on to them all in these separate spaces. And then I began reading Jeff's work, and I was like, this comparison, this comparative framework really mapped onto what I was thinking about and sort of created these threads. So I reached out to Jeff and told him I wanted to work on drawing at Rice. And he said, okay. And then, yeah, I found myself in the archives, and so many of our collections there are just rich with images and drawings or artworks that were never meant to be displayed or shown, but are part of these processes or operations. Or, part of these intimate correspondences, which are all about kind of in different ways about validity, which is a super fascinating way to think about these drawings. The ontological. Well, I've been thinking about. I mean, this is a sort of maybe a poor term, but when I think about these drawings, I kind of think about them as having this potential for this ontological aftershock. You go in. The first time I went in, I picked up this box of letters in the Whitley Strieber collection, and I was surprised by the sheer weight of it, right? So, we have 10 boxes, and you pick up one kind of file box, and it was just so heavy. And that was sort of the first moment. Like it took that, before I started taking out pictures but like hundreds and hundreds of letters in each box. And now we have, I mean, over 1,000 drawings. I've been able to map out all of the drawings in the collection and working on the John Mack archives too. And that's really striking to me. And so they kind of fit into this category of excessive traces. I've been thinking about drawings as excessive traces, as these testimonials or people who've gone to this threshold, and this is what they're able to bring back. And so that's what we have to confront. So it's not up to me to sort of think this is, real, not real. What is this even? But I see each sort of two-dimensional drawing made by an experiencer as an alien itself. And that's what we're confronting. And so by the nature of the excessive trace, I mean, they do feel like these glitches in reality in a way, or this sort of consensus reality. And so the glitch, the aftershock. So that's sort of where I am. And spending so much time on this collection has really helped me think through other drawings, whether they're by mediums or whomever, but drawings that employ a certain sort of frequency. They operate a different frequency.
No, that's great. And I think to be clear, just in case there are folks in the audience that don't know which collection specific that you're referring to, this is the Whitley Strieber collection, which was him soliciting drawings and letters of people that have had encounters with non-human life forms, et cetera. Am I correct in that summary?
Yeah, so the front page of Communion kind of invites you to have a different relationship to reality, and then the last page is his home address. So the whole book is really an invitation, which I think is really wonderful because I see these drawings that came out of it as an invitation. So yeah, I mean, there were, tens of thousands of letters that were sent to Whitley. It was published in 1987. It was on the bestseller list for 6 months. Lots of controversy around it, but it was really popular. And, within the first year. I mean, he maybe had 50,000 letters that were sent to him. And so before I came, like we were, people were aware of the drawings, but they hadn't really been focused on. So I was really excited to go in and sort of start to map that out and just see the different strategies that people employed in terms of adding these sort of visual elements. So sometimes they're embedded within them and they're these tiny sort of doodles, and sometimes they're works of art in their own right, they're watercolor, they're pastel. Sometimes, I mean, there's lots of maps, and sometimes, it'll just be a little drawing of a bed. And like, this is where it happened. And it's this, empty rectangle, but it just for them clearly grounds it in reality as they're sort of grappling with this idea that maybe this was all true. Maybe this all happened. And so a lot of the letters begin with just thank you, Whitley, for having the courage to write this book. You've really, given me that courage to confront this and maybe talk about it for the first time ever.
So that's I want to point out there's a great doubling that Amanda just gave us that there's the encounter with the alien, and then there's the trace that is in itself alien as well, and that introduces the break, the rupture, the glitch. And I want to pass it to Peter for a second, not to make you the sole steward of radar and the more mechanistic interpretation, but for now, I'd like to invite you to just sort of give us the other side of that equation because you're working with an organization that is very seriously looking at the folks in our government, in our institutions, that are also dealing with the alien, right? As it shows up on radar, on photographic plates, and in eyewitness accounts that still land in a place where not everybody believes it, but we have institutions that are coming online that want to investigate it, you know what I mean, make our airspace safer through official recognition, things like that. But before we go there, I'd love to get your side of that same doubling of the alien and the alien.
Sure. I mean, I don't think I wouldn't hear anything, but didn't hear anything in what Amanda had to say that I would want to push against or contradict or anything of the sort. I think what I would say, I'll be a bit pedagogical to begin because I'm not sure that everyone tuning in would be, I mean, why would most people are not part of the conversation about UAP? Okay. And so I think a little background would be helpful.
Mhm.
And then I might say a word about what I think should be emphasized about UAP, which stands for Unidentified Anomalous Phenomena. I don't think everyone in the audience would know that, and that's the rebranding of the UFO. And so there are advantages to using both terms. I mean, what's happened in the U.S. government with respect to UAP or UFOs is twofold. Since 2017 or 2018, you've had increasing interest in the United States Congress from them, which has passed, unbeknownst to most people, eight different laws, eight different pieces of legislation, and there have been others that were proposed that weren't passed, but. Um, for something that isn't supposed to be real in any kind of conventional sense or to exist except in the imagination or fiction, that's pretty remarkable. And that in most of that legislation concerns what is seen as excessive state secrecy around UFOs. And that's an important point because, on the other hand, what has happened, and I can say this both as a scholar and as an individual so embroiled in the process, who's adjacent to government and embroiled in that process, that I know the following to be true. What's also happened in the U.S. government is there has been excessive state secrecy for many decades about UFOs, which again is remarkable they don't. If they're not real in any conventional sense and they or don't exist except in fiction or the imagination. And again, that's why Congress is interested in them. Now, the fact that there's state secrecy and excessive state secrecy, and it's really in the intelligence community primarily, to some extent the Department of Defense. The fact that that secrecy exists tells us something about UFOs, which is that and I'll put this, I mean, I have to put this a bit dogmatically, and I can unpack it later in the discussion, but that secrecy would not exist. And I'm again going to put this dogmatically. It wouldn't be in place if there wasn't something obdurately physical about UFOs, which is to say they return radar. They can knock branches off trees. They can burn the ground. They have a vehicular form consistently, and I would stand by that statement. They consistently, as J. Allen Hynek, who is the astronomer, who is the chief consultant to the Air Force on UFOs from the late 40s through the late 60s, said there's a remarkable consistency in the reporting for something that is supposed to be so fantastic. It ought to be there ought to be inconsistency in the reporting if it's not there. Um, and so the old term UFO is useful because these are objects in a very conventional, ordinary sense, as present in space and continuous in time as anything else, while they are there. Now, the other side of that is is well known to anyone who's kind of into the UAP conversation, is they're accompanied by the sorts of things that uh, Jeff is the most interesting scholar of today, which is psychical phenomena,
Right.
often ostensible telepathy, the impression of telepathic messages, precognition, experiences which seem to be more visionary and dealing with something intangible, even if they somehow impact the senses. And sometimes they shade directly into religious experience, where it's very tough to separate the one from the other. Now, many people think as a result that UFOs belong entirely in the realm of religious experience, that they are supernatural phenomena. I would say they're not. They're very paradoxical ontological entities. I don't know that there is any other entity that is as or that is paradoxical in the same way. Um, and so I note that because what's interesting to me about Amanda's work, the drawings given to Whitley Strieber, um, and the show itself is, starting to think through what's so paradoxical or contradictory about their ontological status, that of UFOs requires a turn to the aesthetic. You need to deal with images. You need to deal with sound. You might need to deal with touching things. And so I think we have not just a novel, but a really fecund kind of frontier line of research, line of artistic research that we see I mean, the show might be really, apart from the work of Trevor Paglen, the first attempt to really deal with the UFO or UAP as an object or a problem, let's say a problem of artistic research.
Oh, excellent. And excellent shout out to Ninth Planet for being there. And I think, and I also want to take you up on the handoff that you were going to give to Jeff about him having another view on this. Before we started, I wanted to frame this initial wave through the discussion in terms of like two rivers that are in the tidal relationship with a far bigger ocean, right? And that there are clearly these forces, some of which Amanda is looking at through drawing. Peter, you're looking at it through philosophy and also through governmental apparatus and the concreteness of it. And you gave Jeffrey this opportunity to talk about um, I don't want to call it larger because that's not really fair. But if we think it, however you want to think about this third space, and there could be fourth, fifth, eighth, 300th, but Jeff is someone who has looked at the sacred and the flip, and this unreliability but consistency of the UAP, in that larger historical context. I'd love for you to say a few things about that for folks.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, maybe I can say some things in this context too that will be helpful. I mean, we started out with the flip. I mean, that the reason that conversation is important here is what Peter spoke of so eloquently. It's the paradox. It's the paradox of what I call radar and revelation. There definitely is a physical component or dimension to this phenomenon. And there definitely is a psychical or religious dimension. And how they're related, we don't know. Um, and the role of aesthetics and art and artists is really important. And just to kind of put a story on that, Whit, who's helping to run this, was in the archives for months. And if I've learned anything in the archives, it's how physical these encounters are. And one of the moments that I can't forget, I don't think I've ever told Peter or Amanda this, is I was working with the files of Stephen Browdy, who's a parapsychologist who wrote a book called The Gold Leaf Lady, which was on this woman that he calls Katie, who exuded this gold leaf from her face and her skin. And Stephen kept this gold leaf in these envelopes, which I then um, spilled on the archival floor, right in front of Wit, actually, and clumsily was scooping gold leaf back up into this. But it just gets at this moment where the physicality of, and this isn't a UAP or a UFO encounter, but our collection mixes and matches these UFO and UAP encounters and abduction experiences with sort of classical parapsychological cases as well. And so the other thing I want to say is the Archives of the Impossible consists of 18 collections, which is only about 1% of the total archives in Woodson Research Center. There are almost 1,600 collections. But that 1% um, gathers some 50% of the researchers who come to Woodson, and about 60% of digital or online research requests. And of our researchers who come to the archives, I think by far the artists outnumber everyone else. So there's something about aesthetics, there's something about visual and material art. And by artists, I also include in there filmmakers. We need to get filmmakers in here and creative writing. Writing is a big component here. The beauty of the Strieber book was, yes, it has this painting on the cover that invites people in, but it itself is a text. And if you read the letters, we have 3,400 of those that Anne culled from these tens of thousands. The power of those letters is how they are asking Whitley for a phone call or a letter. They want some kind of material, physical, personal authorization of their story. They are not looking for fame. They are not looking for money. They are not looking to be known. They want to be told they're not crazy. And the culture is definitely telling them at that point that they're crazy. And so what our archives are trying to do is we're trying to emphasize that power and that authenticity of the experience. But I want to emphasize that that experience is very physical, as Peter said. It's not, we're not talking about just a subjective hallucination here. We're talking about an encounter with something, an entity comes out of another dimension, does something to a person physically. The person draws this, as Amanda said, but it's a very physical, very powerful kind of encounter with an entity. It's not something just in the head or in a personal head.
I mean, there's so much going on that you guys have put um, into the mix, and what I love about it is that it's so hard to just you can't just walk away and stick it back together, right?
No, it can't.
Um, it, it,
That's why it's great. It's because you
it's so
cannot do that.
it's really wonderful. Like you really can't, and it doesn't matter like how hardcore you are about your particular, and not by you, I don't mean you three, but I mean one's particular um, adherence to a point of view inevitably dissolves into someone else's with the UAP. And so there's something, profoundly transformative about this. And I want to drill down a little bit more about just what do you guys think the role of the archive is, right? When I think about what was assembled from Strieber's requests, what is being secured and hoarded, some might say, by our intelligence communities. What is it about this tension between needing the archive records this stuff? Witnesses and researchers want to validate or justify their position. I want you guys to tackle that a little bit about like what it is about the archive in general and its role in sort of truth making or truth pushing or truth pulling.
Well, I'll just start off a conversation. I think the archives, again, they're very physical. It's like Amanda's saying, this box is heavy. You pull out this box and you're like, and if you look at the actual archival space where the box is set, it's huge and it's a big physical space. And again, it's artists coming to work on the materiality of this material. But the other thing about an archive, which I love as as a human being, is its multi-generationality. It is not dependent on a person. It's not even dependent on a single generation. It just goes and goes and goes. Generations of researchers and inquirers and conversation partners come in, artists come in, and they do what they do with it. We don't want to tell them what to do. We don't know what to do, but certainly do something, engage this material. But it's that multi-generationality that I think is really so powerful. And people love the fact that it's located in a research university. They really do. And I think that's important too.
Next up, maybe YouTube as the archive for other content, classified and unclassified.
Yeah, it's interesting because I mean, I'm glad that Jeff, you brought this up, kind of the physicality and back to letters, because you really can't pull the drawings and the letters apart. And each one of those, it has so much to do with trauma and describing PTSD and being sick and physical pain and all of that. So it's a really tricky thing because I think that's something to be so mindful of, but at the same time, to sort of get to what you just asked, I think a lot of people see, where sort of religion meets the anomalous here in this particular place, they see it as a frontier. And so I think that's what draws a lot of artists to this space because I've sat on so many like thesis panels for fourth year painters. And if they bring up, spirituality, religion, magic, the esoteric, like they get so quickly. And so I think that they are so excited about this space and in ways that aren't flippant at all, but like really excited about this space that really feels like a frontier where it just sort of opens up the imagination. And so to have this sort of external, stable, permanent record of these things, I think is so valuable. And I think that is, again, something that, in the way that, our first permanent images did this, they sort of push this cognition forward. People can go into these spaces and think differently. And again, they're invitations to really engage with things that they've never thought of before, offer new opportunities. But it's really an experience to be in there. And then, moving from, you can be in there and move from the Anna Whitley Strieber to the remote viewing, which is a whole nother sort of mind-bending exercise. And so you just sort of have all of these sort of takes on things that do have to do with the physical and the psi. I mean, those were people who were being trained to be psychic spies, not just to sort of, live in the mind, right? But like to actually impact sort of Cold War logistics. And so, yeah, it's such a complex space in that way because you try to hold, those things that are really sensitive, the vulnerability, but then they also are able to be a catalyst for, what we haven't even sort of seen yet.
What I would follow up with here is, I mean, I'm not, as I think some people in the audience will know, I'm not formally part of Archives of the Impossible. I mean, this is, Amanda and Jeff are, um, with Karen Austin and a couple other people at Rice are the people that really the main archivists there as well who are responsible for that project and so I'll speak about it as a researcher. Now, and I, and I don't want to give away my hand here, so I'm going to be a bit oblique, but there are specific collections in that archive which are gold for me because I'm trying to figure out. I'm not just trying to reflect philosophically on UAP and so-called non-human intelligence. I'm trying to get to ground truth about a few things, and I do think you can get to ground truth a few things about them. And this is a world-changing problem that for which there is no literature. And I say that, of course, there are some books, but that's not a literature. And we have tens, if not hundreds of thousands of people just in the United States who are participating, with great passion, and with great mental resources in a public conversation about UAP, thinking that there's a literature, thinking that journalists, scientists, intellectuals, whether these folks are academics or not, but often they are, have established something approaching what we would normally call a set of facts. And as I look at it just empirically, I don't see that at all.
Mm.
I see a mess of stuff that people think is data in the scientific sense. I see stuff that would be data in the social scientific or even humanistic sense, but it's not gathered anywhere. And the archives have some collections that for me are really important because I can go back to UAP events I know of and look at what some key researchers did as they were first investigating them. And that allows me to consider whether they need to be reinterpreted. That additionally allows me, the more I look at such cases, to correlate them and think about whether general reinterpretations are called for. And I'm somebody who thinks they're called for, but I have to really put this each time I think something needs to be reinterpreted to the empirical test. And the archive is really, really unique in that regard. But I mention all this because what people don't get that about the archives of the impossible. They
Right.
they get that it's this unique repository about the so-called paranormal, UFOs, adjacent things, and there's and it's we should be very excited that artists are first on the scene. I would say they're partly first on the scene because despite the trouble they have in their field for it, they still have more permission socially than academics to cop to an interest or an experience of a psychical phenomena or certain kinds of religious experience. Um, but what I think is in their approach often to UAP and adjacent things, it's not the responsibility of artists to try to think generally in an intellectual or scientific fashion about what's true or false about something. I mean, we know there's a lot of artistic research that does that. And so I think a lot of the academics, as the UAP thing becomes, as we achieve public consensus about its reality, they're going to light up and realize like, okay, you need 1,000 books on this, and there's like there's one archive that has bothered to collect some of the research and the letters and papers of some of the key people, Jacques Vallée,
Definitely. Yeah.
Whitley Strieber, but also Richard Haynes stuff is there, who people don't know so well. And I mention him because it's a good segue into the show. You guys have in the show some remarkable images from Richard Haynes' research and his organization, his UFO research organization from the 80s and 90s. And so anyway, that's my take on what's important about the archives of the
Oh,
And
impossible.
the other thing I will say to that, Peter, is the reason we have Dick's collection is because of Jacques. So it there's a kind of I call it a black hole. Once you start to accrue particular collections and particular people, then they say, hey, they talk to their friends and they're like, you can trust this or you can do this, and then it just snowballs. There's a kind of gravitas to it that kicks in.
Before we pivot to our sort of last movement, I want to go back to Peter for a second, so that folks know that I also wanted to think about just archives in general and how there are these archives of now, footage that you can find, and there are archives of stories and Project Blue Book. I mean, there are all these parallel efforts to document the phenomena. And I love what you just said, Peter, about how artists have a little bit more permission than academics to enter in this space, but then artists have no credibility in the face of a general that's talking about a tic tac that's going in and out of the water. And it's not that I want to like look at that particular instance, but it's the role that as we accumulate records of the phenomena in different ways, like some being more about quantity because it's like it's literally digital, right? Like we're getting ones and zeros out of this and we're using that to make our cases, right? And on the other hand, you have, drawing and traces. So before we sort of conclude with another discussion of drawing in particular, I wanted to see if you'd riff a little bit, all of you, on the other archives that are out there that are fueling our discussions about the phenomena.
Well, because you mentioned me, I think you wanted me to respond to something like that, so I'm gonna jump in
Yeah,
if
yeah,
I
yeah, please.
I first want to say, and I'm to do the work I do with Soul, and if you really want to work on UAP, okay, because unless you think they're just completely supernatural, you have to think about how to be very diplomatic, and you have to do very diplomatic kind of work across social fields, across so-called cultural and political spectrum, in ways that are very uncomfortable, okay, for most people. And I'm not saying everyone can do that because I think there are social positions, so-called identities that where it's a lot tougher to do that diplomatic work. So I want to flag that it might be easier for me. But I also want to say that look, let's say in the humanities, the humanistic social sciences, in our practice, in our theory, in a lot of cultural institutions, we can be a bit precious about ourselves. Okay. And what I mean is that we always feel that, the kind of form, the intellectual form, the writerly form, the aesthetic form to is something that we always have to stick to in every context. Well, that's why the general or the congressperson might not, we believe, listen to an artist. But having been part of these conversations, oh no, they're very interested in artists. They're very interested in religionists. They're very interested in anthropologists. They're very interested in filmmakers. And I don't just mean people who do things in a very mainstream key. I mean they are interested if we do a little bit, if we adjust form a little bit to address them. And I'll say as a case in point, I won't point immediately to art, but I'll point to anthropology. And I have to be a bit oblique about this. But an anthropologist who works in the intelligence community was absolutely key to gathering reports very recently from military pilots and aviators, gathering data about that and then getting that to Congress. And and I was very surprised to learn that. And I learned it from someone who was responsible for a certain government component. It's well known publicly that provided information to Congress. Someone could infer, what this was, but let's say they did a congressional report, very well known. And the person in charge of that component said to me, well, we had an anthropologist on staff, and that person was absolutely key to getting the aviators to open up because they would sit in the room and not cop to seeing, we would do group interviews. They would not cop to having seen a UFO, but because we had an anthropologist who knew how to ask questions in let's say an intelligent fashion, oblique, indirect, very relationally, we got a lot of data, ultimately. And
They draw anything? I got it. Did they draw anything?
well, but this is the thing. Of course they draw things. And of course witnesses draw things. And this is the whole thing with the archive is like, of course. And so I actually think that that artists can play a tremendous role. I mean, we know this generally in all sorts of public conversations or institutional conversations that they're going to shy away from because they're not the spaces they're comfortable in generally. But in this conversation specifically, I think artists can play an absolutely tremendous role, and they should kind of step up and do that, boldly and with some courage, because even I can think of specific Republicans in Congress that would appreciate a presentation of the art of experiencers. And it's not like they don't know about the archives of the impossible. I mean, that's that's the thing is everyone's part of the same conversation right now, and it's a very the interlocutors in the conversation are a very heterogeneous bunch, and so you'd be surprised who's listening to who and who's talking to who. I mean, Jeff has experienced this many times in the dialogues he stages at the Esalen Institute. Sorry for the long-winded answer, but I want to mention that. I mean, this
No,
is.
that's great. Did Jeff or Amanda, did you want to elaborate on any of that? Or riff or respond?
Yeah, I mean, it made me think, what Peter you just said made me think a little bit of the video footage of John Mack going to Zimbabwe, right? And like using drawing as a tool to invite people to open up. There were dozens of students, but also the teachers there. And so I think that art can operate in this really interesting way. And what I'm excited about, I'll keep this pretty short, is in the archives is finding a way like to sort of reinvigorate those drawings as testimonials and thinking about different lenses to put on them. And so, whether that's, through the esoteric art, and we're talking about elements like initiation, or we're looking at forensic art techniques that John Mack used, that Ted Seth Jacobs used when he worked. So he was the artist who did the painting for Communion, the book cover, and he used the forensic art technique when he was working with Bud Hopkins and experiencers. He used it with Whitley Strieber. Whitley went to his studio on the Upper East Side in like 1987. But also like self-taught artists. So like these drawings actually have, these tentacles into all these different fields that it can all be really mutually reinforcing to sort of zoom out and sort of, yeah, have a greater discussion about them.
Fantastic. Jeff, anything?
Well, just to riff a bit on that, I mean, the thing about the UFO or the UAP is it's extremely popular on both sides of the aisle, to speak politically. It doesn't honor political or uh, boundaries. It just doesn't. And it also, one of the things we're interacting with a lot and struggling with a bit, but also really curious about is the sort of global, cross-cultural, gendered, and racial reach of this phenomenon. How these experiences show up in marginalized communities in particular, and communities that aren't represented, for example, in our archive very well, where our archive is determined by who wrote Whitley Strieber, or the remote viewing program, or what plane incidences or what flight incidences Dick Haynes researched or came to him. So there are inherent limitations on our collections, and on the other hand, these things happen everywhere and to everyone. And so the question for me is always, are we really talking about the phenomenon being more evident or more expressive in certain places or among certain communities, or are we talking about social censorship and people just not talking about the event or the phenomenon? I suspect it's the latter, by the way. I suspect strongly it's the latter. Um, but I think that's the deeper question. And what Amanda hinted at, what I call the traumatic secret. There's a lot of trauma and there's a lot of suffering here. And this opens people up to the phenomenon, but it also results in a kind of healing impulse, but also a potential negativity around the phenomenon that is really poignant and rich, and we need to really pay attention to as certainly as people thinking about these things in a responsible way.
I mean, that's such a strong way to finish. And I actually don't want to do my last movement because you kind of we've wrapped back to the opening quote, right? And the quantifiable versus the quality and the quantity, right? And the idea that there really is no outside to this phenomenon, which I think is really fascinating, is that, like, and if you're going to treat it holistically and completely, like, you cannot avoid some of the things that Jeff mentioned in terms of, like, the longer history of it. I mean, there's work in the show that speaks about the indigenous American traditions that have long accepted sky people, as people that have intersected with us. But I want to, like, let's finish on that qualitative side. In terms of any, I'll tell a short one to sort of set that stage. And I was very honored to cook for all the artists that were in Lagrange Point the night before the opening. They all came to our apartment. A lot of them had not met each other, and it was just amazing to feed all of these folks. A lot of them had never met each other, and to really bring everybody together around food and fellowship, and knowing that the phenomena was there, right? I mean, it's not that it manifested, but the very fact that we were having this meal is 100% connected to any number of those pilots that Peter mentioned, right? And I think that's sort of the interesting connection between all of this. So if any of you want to share that sort of opening story, whether it's personal or testimony, I would love for us to conclude, with this. Any way you want to open us up and send us off, rather than shutting things down, that would be great. Or concluding, I should say.
I can say very quickly. So I still teach experimental drawing in the summer, and I quite regularly have my students do remote viewing as an exercise, and we use JPEGs, and it's such a wonderful exercise to do because it isn't about like I actually always have students who get it, and it's really shocking and surprising, and then you have students who feel bad that they didn't get it. But it's such a unique opportunity to think about, to all sit together and think together about like where do these images come from? How do we think about that mental landscape? And like things you've never thought before, and then attempting to verbalize them within this sort of collective where it isn't really about getting it, which some people do, but it really is about just sort of, thinking about how we reach out towards something or
Mm.
bring something towards us. And that's what I think drawing is so exceptional at, like the way it can sort of reach out and bring in.
I love how you just casually mentioned that you run remote viewing sessions in your classes. I love
It's a whole thing.
it.
It might be their favorite thing to do, but it's a great, it's a great conversation starter, and like just the sort of the humanity of them sharing in these sort of bizarre. Anyway, I've gone on, but it's really
That's
fun.
great. Thank you. Next, whoever wants to claim the moment.
Peter, do you want to go or you want me to go?
Yeah, yeah, I could say something. I mean, I'll say something very simple. I think I understood, if I heard you correctly, you were, kind of calling for, us to say some things that might open things up, specifically with respect to, the experiences that are at the heart of, this conversation, or that stimulate this conversation, that stimulated the show. I mean, I do work, research with so-called experiencers and then simply witnesses to UFOs. I mean, that's something, if you really want to understand this stuff as an academic or intellectual, you have to do that because there's not enough on it that you can just you just can't use other people's cases. And there's a genre of UFO sighting that I find very intriguing, which is that of um, pilots and flight attendants on just normal passenger flights who see vehicles in the sky and then never say anything about them. And I did an interview sometime in the last year with a woman who was a flight attendant in the 90s, who said, she was, and I want to kind of leave us with this because it's very apropos of the conversation. She said that she was, going about her duties, and she was near the cockpit, and one of the pilots kind of leaned out and said, "Hey, do you want to see something?" And she said, "Yeah." And he said, "Come in here." And she kind of, went into the cockpit, or, popped her head in, and he said, "Look over there." And she said there was a gigantic uh, cigar-shaped, uh, uh, dark or black metallic UFO hovering near the plane. And she said it was hundreds of feet in length or diameter. And she looked at it with astonishment and then looked at the pilot and said, what is that?" And he looked at her nervously and just made a gesture like, "We don't know." And she watched it for a couple minutes. It did nothing. Um, and she said she had the distinct impression it was aware of them, or its occupants, or whatever intelligence was within, or controlling it, was aware of them. And she watched it for a couple minutes, and then she returned to um, her work. And I said, "Well, then what?" And she said, "I can't remember the next 2 hours." She said, I can remember the end of the flight and I'm still working, but she describes being dissociated for that time. And of course, that's a common reaction to UFO sightings. And I would say we don't know why. In some cases, I mean, there's the presumption that this is always something the UFO does. It induces dissociation or amnesia. And certainly I'm familiar with cases where you'd have to assume that. Is this, and I asked her, I said, "Is this a reaction of dissociation because this was too much for you to see, or do you feel like it was somehow artificially induced?" And she said, I really don't know. Um, but I feel that her narrative is, I think, useful for us and probably for the audience, in light of the show, because this is an image. This is a visual. This is sense perception, it's visual perception. It's an object that I would liken to, yeah, it's identifiable as a vehicle, but it's so astonishing, and it's so enigmatic that in a sense one can't know what one is looking at. There's a kind of there's some cognitive failure or a cognitive block to that. And so no wonder that dissociation could be a reaction to that, if indeed it was spontaneous. And I think that, one of the wonders of the show, which I loved, I spent many hours in it at the opening, is that it's a non-dissociative response to the anomalous. And that I think is I mean, I think sometimes artists and people doing research in art don't value their work or appreciate it enough, in the sense art is often the non-dissociative response to sense perception that induces dissociation or induces denial, and that may actually induce trauma. So that's how I would kind of, take my hats off, or give a hats off to to all the artists and the artworks.
Yeah, beautifully put. Jeff, did you want to add anything, or do we pivot over to Q&A? We do have a few.
I think we pivot, David. I think it's okay. We pivot to Q&A.
Right on. Well,
Thank
before
you,
we do
Jeff.
that, I want to say
Amanda.
thank you so much to all three of you. Um, I feel really honored that we had this discussion. I love the flow. I love the ease and the naturalness. I mean, I think it's a really great Friday activity. To
Are
be
you cooking, by the way? Now I'm hungry. I'm
Yeah, the
just
next time, I mean, we got absolutely yes. Anytime you're in the city,
all right.
we will absolutely cook for you.
We'll take you up on that.
I think it's folks from Slash, so they're going to handle the Q&A, or am I reading them out loud? I've already forgotten. I've dissociated already. Wait, I think there's an answer in the chat. Okay, Anna's
Hi,
going to help.
David. We were
Thank you, Anna.
hoping that you would do that. And we will close it later. Yeah. Thank you for handling it.
Okay, so the first question is from Drew Levanti. Thank you for asking, Drew. The question is, outside of the archive, what are some of the texts that have helped the panelists interpret the archive? How might a piece from Lagrange Point inform your sensation in the archives going forward? Amanda's aftershocks reminded me of the big gold zappy circle on the wall. That's Whit Forrester's piece. Anybody who wants to handle that one? And I'm happy. Well, actually, I think only Peter has seen the show, right? Because Jeffrey, Amanda, have you seen it or not? No.
I've seen images, but I've not been fortunate enough to be in this space.
So I'll put you on the spot, Amanda. Is there anything you've seen in the images that you feel might carry forward as you continue with your work? Even though you selected, I mean, you were sort of an artist in the show, so this is a question that's each its own in a way. Um, but what do you think? Is there anything you've seen that can take you forward?
I mean, not a specific artwork, but just how like varied it is, like all of the different perspectives that they're able to hold together. I really appreciate that, and that's something that I think is reflective in the archives. And I mean, the archives could probably even sort of, I think we are working on uh having more diverse voices in there as well. So I think that's something that I really value and sort of was had a sense of immediately.
Right. I'm going to get to our second question. This is from Ben Grohl. I hope I've said your name right. How would institutions, faith, science, and culture adjust to the possible revelation of truly non-human intelligence? This is like the question and the Uber question of the entire UAP.
I'm going to go ahead and just take that one since that's I mean that's the sole foundation specialty.
Fair enough.
And in fact, why Gary Nolan and I were asked to start the thing by somebody out of government. The answer is we don't know. And I spent actually right before this panel, I was on a call with a neuroepidemiologist who I'm doing we're doing a mixed method epidemiological study. I'm the anthropologist, the one doing ethnography in it. He's the one who knows how to do survey stuff and gather quantitative data, which would be about, in epidemiological terms, decision making following various kinds of disclosure events. So we don't know how in general, now this would be focused on the United States, how people would respond to that. What I can say, not just anecdotally, this would be a kind of let's say early stage interpretation or hypothesis of an anthropologist is that I don't think people 40 or 35 and under generally have a big problem with the reality of UAP or UFOs. That's a kind of Generation X up to boomers thing where that's still shameful, preposterous, something to be in the closet about, something ridiculous, the topic of the insane. And I've certainly, I've encountered many graduate students, and I can go back a number of years on this, who kind of said to me, like, I don't understand. I read those New York Times stories. Why isn't anybody more interested in this? And I think that's where a lot of people are on this who are it's not just young, but like, let's say not old. And I think we can have confidence that people are sort of um, uh, uh, ready in that sense. The trouble is we don't know. I would say we generally, in talking about this, don't have a strong enough appreciation for true and false with respect to the UFO problem. It's very easy, first, if you've never seen one or experienced them, to view it kind of as a curiosity or kind of casually. But even if you have, it's very easy to not appreciate that, like, if the US government, and I know this for a fact, has monitored and studied this and maybe more for decades, they do know some things. And, it changes things a lot if some of these are of extraterrestrial origin, it changes things a lot. It changes things a lot if the occupants, which are seen with them, are in fact not illusions or of perception or induced in the minds of the observers, but they're really there. And it changes things tremendously if they're biological entities, products of evolution. I mean, that changes things tremendously, and we will have an animal response to that as living beings, right? And I think I've seen some people when they realize that UFOs are real, they have an animal response of like, oh, there's a possibly predatory species in the environment. That 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 changes things. And so we don't know, depending on what's true or false in that regard and what's known about capability and intent, to use kind of national security language. We don't know how people would respond to all of that. And this is why you need really social dialogue across institutions, across cultures, across national boundaries, so that we can develop narrative, aesthetic, conceptual frameworks by which to metabolize the facts depending on what they are. Because what you don't want with this is the amount of public interest, and eventually leading to more government acknowledgement and then more public consensus. It, Natural, or it's kind of a curiosity, and I don't think, again, there would be secrecy around this if there wasn't some intelligence community. And the reason I say that I know this has been studied is I have been told too many times by people exactly in the position to know that, yes, there's a component in the intelligence community that works on this. And yes, there's something that might be difficult to absorb in what's known. So I think in that regard, it's extremely serious matter, and we have to have a lot of humility and caution about assuming that we know what would happen if there was greater acknowledgement, but also like how different institutions, how different cultures, different societies would respond.
Okay. We're coming up on our last 2 minutes, and we have a question from one of the curators, and this is for everybody, and this deserves your punchiest hot take answer, but I think we've covered it, but it'll be fun to land on some energy like this. Trisha asks, when we started this project and began to circulate the idea of an exhibition on NHI, UAP, alien life, we encountered a lot of pushback, skepticism, and ridicule. Why are these subject areas so impossible for people to believe? And I think that's the nugget of the question. Like, why are these areas so impossible for people to believe? Your hot takes.
So if I can start on that one, I'm going to bounce off something Peter has said and Amanda has definitely said as well, is if you speak to people who encounter these objects, the definitive core of their experience is one of shock. And it actually doesn't fit in. And I suspect, or I think that human beings are what Peter suggested were animals that think that our senses and our mathematics and our science and can somehow encapsulate what's going on. And it's likely it cannot. It's likely this is truly not us and not reducible to any model that we have. And I think this is one reason that people respond so vehemently or with such denial to this topic is it just violates the basic sensibilities that people have, whether they're scientific and secular or whether they're religious or whether there's something in between. It does not fit in.
So it doesn't fit. Next hot take.
Yeah, I'll say I agree with that. I think that's a huge part of it. I also think that, talking again from the perspective of someone in the arts who sees a lot of people who are interested in these subjects, like there's no way forward. Even like you think about art as being this big open field, but like it's actually in terms of what you are like in order to go to art school to teach. I mean, it's such a huge investment of time and money, and you go in there into these institutions and there's sort of one way to go in and be successful, and you have to be part of this conversation. So I think that there's also sort of a limit in terms of like what space exists on the other side. And also I think that there are people who just don't have time for it. The people who are the most like people in general, when I'm on an airplane, I'm traveling, walking my dog, they're very responsive. But the people who are just like, why would you do that? Are people who like work 18-hour days, like people who don't have that. And I respect that. And I'm not going to try to convince you to care about that. So I think that there are a few different factors for sure, but those are three that I would point to.
I kind of want to leave the last word to the artist here on that one. Ain't got time for UFOs, like being one of the one of the valid answers.
It's my life.
Until it happens to you, right? Like, and this is why it goes around and around and around.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, I'm gonna ask Slash if they want to run this a little longer. Ben Grohl does have a follow-up question, but I do have a sense
Oh,
that it
could
will.
could I go ahead and
Yeah, yeah,
answer?
yeah. Hot
Give
take it.
my hot
Yeah.
take. I won't give in the book I'm writing on really so-called NHI, not just UAP. I try in the introduction to answer that question.
Mm,
And I do think it's a form of denial. That's a very easy answer, of course. And and it goes back to what I mentioned about I think it's very disturbing to us to imagine another species enough like us to fashion technologies and have science and so on. And the simple unconscious inferences we draw based on that are I'm not going to say they're traumatic, but they're too much to metabolize. And I think for moderns, in the sense of those of us who are kind of fully children of modernity and live within its cosmology and ontology. Well, that's a heavy blow to our sense of our ascendancy, our power, our sense that we live the ultimate good life, which we really believe this, most of us, that somehow, our the quality of our apartments, our homes, our technologies, et cetera, make us the greatest human beings who've ever lived or something. And I think this is disturbing at that level. And I think we built up over the decades a kind of resistance to this that stems from that. And my last statement as well, and this is fairly, I mean, the origins of this are trivial. This is genealogy in the Nietzschean sense to point to this, but I think one condition of this is we inverted fiction and fact with UFOs in beginning in the 1950s, and you have generations that are perfectly comfortable with UFOs and so-called ETs and so-called NHI as fiction, and yet it turns out, and it's very strange, it turns out that that's not fiction; it's fact. And yet, once something has been defined that way, like getting it out of its inversion and getting right side up is extremely difficult.
right on. I'd like to thank our panelists for a really, really, really great discussion. So, Peter, Amanda, Jeffrey, thank you so much for taking the time. Slash, thank you so much for hosting this conversation and archiving it, because I think a lot of people will loop back to this when they hear about the quality and the tone of the discussion. Ben, we're going to apologize because we have to wrap, but I think you can balance the risk of catastrophic disclosure with the ethical dilemma of classifying reality. That's part of your homework. Um, Thank you so much. Slash, please take over and take us out.
Thank you, David. Thanks, everyone. Thanks to the audience and the panelists and our curators, Night Planet. Just an announcement that tomorrow is the last day of the exhibition. And there will be a closing reception with a bunch of events. So if you are local, please come stop by. If you're not local, but you're still interested in the show, there is an amazing essay that David wrote that's accompanying the exhibition. So please check that out too. If I just posted the links. And one last shout out to the Andy Warhol Foundation of the Arts to making the exhibition possible, for their generosity. So thank you, everyone, and hope to see you tomorrow. Bye.